past growth model of China, relying on cheap labor, imported technology, can no longer work because so many other countries have much lower labor costs.
A China é um dos principais atores atuais das relações econômicas internacionais. Ao mesmo tempo, a recente queda do crescimento anual da China é algo que vem preocupando a muitos economistas do mundo. As relações econômicas entre Brasil e China são muito grandes. É por isso que nós vamos conversar agora com o professor Shang-Jin Wei, da Universidade Columbia, é um profundo entendedor das relações entre China e o restante do mundo. Professor Shang-Jin Wei, thank you very much for being here with us. And then as a starting question, I'd like to know the gradual decline in China's growth performance in the recent years is something that is getting very worrisome for some circles around the world. Is there any reason to panic, or is it's expected that China, as it becomes a middle-income country, is something that it was expectable?
Chinese growth moderation starting from 2012 is quite understandable, so therefore it's not reason to be panicked. There are two structural reasons and some transitory reasons. Transitory reasons, of course, includes relatively weak global economy. China is a very open economy. Trade to GDP ratios higher than US and Japan. So when world economy is weaker, China's economy is not doing as well. That's a temporary factor that can be potentially reversed once global economy recovers. But there are also structural factors, and two are most important. One is the fact that the Chinese working age cohort, workforce, has been shrinking since 2012 in absolute size. So the workforce, number of people between the age 15 to 60 has been declining roughly at a rate of 0.3% a year. So you have fewer and fewer bodies working. By itself, this would translate into a lower GDP growth, even if not GDP per capita growth. That's one factor. Second factor for the slowdown is China's past success. Because China has been growing so fast, wage rate has increased very, very fast. 20 years ago, China was one of the world's poorest country in the world. The income is probably 1/10 of that of Brazil. Today, Chinese income level is within striking distance with Brazil, essentially the same. And both Brazil and China are upper middle income countries. That by my calculation, out of 130 or so non-OECD countries, most of them would have labor cost lower than Brazil, lower than China. That means, the past growth model of China, relying on cheap labor, imported technology, can no longer work because so many other countries have much lower labor costs. For example, India, a country with almost the same population size as China, its wage rate is only 1/3 or 1/4 of that of China. Vietnam, another very large country with 100 million people, its wage rate is much lower. Bangladesh, its labor cost is even lower than India. That means you cannot compete with those countries on cheap labor. By necessity, you have to grow based on higher productivity and based on innovation. And the very nature of innovation-based growth, productivity-based growth, means the growth rate will not be as fast going forward than in the past. In that sense, the growth slowdown is not that surprising. Now, of course, it's useful to note that Chinese growth rate used to be double-digit. Today, when we are talking about slowdown, so for example, in 2016, the growth rate is likely on the order of 6.7%. So it's lower growth rate relative to 4 years ago, but it's not lowest growth in the world. It's pretty high growth rate. So that's a perspective to taking into mind. And my projection is that the growth rate will progressively come down because of the shrinking labor force, because of higher wage cost, to something on the order of 5% by the end of the decade. So it's lower than before, but not that low in absolute sense.
Yeah, you recently mentioned, I think that's a singular demographic aspect of this slowing down of the China annual growth. There's a relation with the one-child policy in the past that has some very unique developments in China nowadays. Explain this for us, please.
Sure. So China's so-called one-child policy, it's not exactly precise name, but it's referring to a relatively strict family planning policy put in place by the government since the early 1980s that restricts the number of children a typical family can have. For typical families, they can have one child. So this policy was put into place in 1980s. This has two effects on economic growth. On the one hand, for the next 2 decades, because fewer children were born than nature intended, for the next 2 decades, China has unusually or unnaturally favorable dependence ratio, meaning the number of people who need to be supported relative to people who are working is very favorable, very low, because fewer children are born. That helps the growth rate relative to other countries. But the exact same factor, of course, also means that after a while, this positive, so-called positive factor to the growth can turn negative. That is, starting from 2012, because in the past, too few children were born. Now, too few people are entering labor force, and yet their parents, grandparents, and grandparents' colleagues are retiring. So suddenly, China switched to have unusually, unnaturally favorable dependence ratio to have unusually, unnaturally unfavorable dependence ratio, because too few people are working, and yet retirees are growing very, very fast. So that's one factor that in the past was helping the growth and now start to hurt the growth. The second factor is when you restrict number of children people can have, one response is because many Chinese families prefer to have at least one son among their offsprings. Not as many sons as possible, but you want to have at least one son. So when they are told that they can only have one child, some of the family choose to have gender-selective abortions, meaning that if they are expecting to have a boy, they go ahead to have the child. If they expect to have a daughter, some of them, not all of them, will choose to abort the girl in order to try one more time, and hopefully they will get a son. This pattern therefore produced an unnatural boys to girls ratio at birth, starting from 1980s and becoming progressively worse over time. So by now, the boys to girls ratio at birth is about 118 per 100. At the premarital, for the dating period, dating and marriage period is, let's say, 15 to 30. That ratio is about 115 to 100. So what does 115 to 1.15? So man to woman ratio is 1.15. Young man to young woman ratio is 1.15. What does that mean? Well, in most countries, I assume in Brazil, the ratio will be 1 to 1, or very close to 1 to 1. 1.15 means that approximately 1 out of every 9 young men cannot find a girlfriend or wife, mathematically speaking, because you have too many young men to young women. That paradoxically, this factor makes young men unhappy, parents of young men unhappy. But this paradoxically adds to the growth rate. How does it add to the growth rate? Well, since you have a relative shortage of brides in the dating market, marriage market, and most men want to have a girlfriend and a wife, and most parents with a son want their son to get married. So they're going to ask themselves, what can I do so that I will not be an involuntary bachelor, or my son will not be an involuntary bachelor. Once they ask themselves that question, they realize that saving and working harder helps. Why? Because wealthy men have a relatively better chance to find a girlfriend or wife than poorer men. The next US president is an example of that. But that's not really unique to US or China. Throughout world history, in any country, wealthy men have an easier time to find girlfriend than a wife than poorer men. I, in fact, would assert that there are no wealthy involuntary bachelors in world history. So implication, so parents say, we got to try harder to make ourselves a bit wealthy. We don't have to be billionaire. We just want to make sure we are wealthy enough relative to other family with a son. So my son will be more competitive than other young men in the marriage market. One way to do this is to raise savings rate. That's one of the reasons why Chinese savings rate, household savings rate in particular, is so much higher than many other countries. I understand Brazil's national savings rate is about 15%. That is the sum of household savings, company savings, and government savings about 15%. The Chinese number is about 50%, of which half of them comes from household savings. Household saves a lot. And one of the reasons they save, but this is not part of Chinese culture. So my research shows that the savings rate has been rising very steadily over time. And my research shows that the gender ratio imbalance is one of the triggers, not the only one, for that. Across regions, some regions have more severe gender ratio imbalance than other regions. What you find is those regions with more severe gender ratio imbalance also give you higher household savings. So higher savings allows cost of capital, cost of investment to be cheaper, so that gives you higher growth rate. The other factor coming from gender ratio imbalance is that families and young men also choose to work harder than otherwise, because working harder is another way to get more income. That's why when I take our Columbia Business School students to China visiting international companies, local companies, one of the common comments people make is how hard the Chinese would work. They would sacrifice leisure. When the rural migrant workers come into cities, they don't just look for a job. They ask, does your company do overtime? What they have in mind is if the company does not do overtime, they don't want to work there. They want to have overtime. Because, my research indicates that parents with a son at home, unmarried son at home, coming from regions with more unbalanced sex ratio are much more likely to want to work in the cities, endure hardship, and to ask to work overtime. So people choose to work harder, and they also contribute to a higher GDP growth rate. The third channel is that some of the people also, other way to earn more income is to take more risks, including physical risk, getting into construction work, mining, and so on. Those are relatively dangerous, risky, less pleasant kind of work. But those jobs pay better, and many people choose to do that. So family planning policy gives you a gender ratio imbalance and give you higher savings, more willingness to work longer, harder, and more risk-taking, entrepreneurship, risk-taking, and so on. They give you higher growth rate. So part of the growth rate comes from that. I need to point out very importantly that this does not mean that sex ratio imbalance is a good thing. I was Asian Development Bank's chief economist until recently. I certainly would not go to developing countries or advise their governments or tell Brazil that in order to have higher growth rate, you should artificially generate gender ratio imbalance. Why not? Well, it's very, logic is very simple. Even though gender ratio imbalance adds a bit percentage points, my estimation is about 2 percentage points of GDP growth comes from gender ratio imbalance. That's a bad growth. That does not make people higher. Not every incremental growth rate produces happy outcome. This is an example of this. Why? Because people choose to work harder, save more, take more risk, because they think their action can improve their son's probability of getting married. Their action can improve their self chance to get married. Yet, for the economy as a whole, for the country as a whole, the total number of people who cannot get married is independent of national savings rate, GDP growth rate. It's determined entirely by ratio of young men to young women. In other words, all those extra effort comes from inability to coordinate. That is, if everyone can choose to work less, save less, people will be happier, and they will not change who will get married, who will not get married. Yet you cannot coordinate that. So no individual dare to reduce his own savings rate, own work effort, because there you guarantee yourself to be a bachelor. So a lot of people supply extra work, extra savings, work very hard to hope for some outcome which cannot be realized in the aggregate. In that sense, this extra GDP growth comes with unhappiness. So if one were to eliminate generation imbalance, which I advocate, you will make Chinese GDP growth rate to come down by about 2 percentage points. Yet, most people in the country will be happier. So it's a long answer about a connection between family planning policy to GDP growth.
Amazing. Professor, but now you got this country, middle-income country nowadays. You had to make adjustments in the economy, and companies will have to adjust. Recently, you phrase it as the 4 options of a Chinese company nowadays as down, up, out, or
in. That's right. Yes.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, so first of all, the challenge China is facing, in a way similar to Brazil, is that the labor cost is so much higher than many other developing countries. What used to work in the past is no longer working. What do you do? Now, at the company level, this down, up, out, and in are the 4 options. By you can by going down, meaning you can shut down your company and do something else. Of course, shutting down your company once you become not competitive is an option for a firm, but not option for a country, right? The up means you have to upgrade. You have to do. You used to produce cheap garment. Now you have to switch to produce high-end garment. China is the world's largest textile and garment exporter since 2001. Continue to be overwhelming any other countries. So China used to be competing with Bangladesh, Vietnam, and so on. Today, it needs to compete with Italian firms and French firms, the high-end garment. It's not there yet, but that's what they need to do. And instead of continue to produce cheap garment and textile, you can switch to producing machines used to produce textile and garments. I predict that some of the successful Chinese companies are going to do that. They're going to, instead of exporting cheap garment, they're going to exporting machines to produce garment to Vietnam, India, and so on. So that's the up part. You can also move in. So China is geographically very large, similar to Brazil. The labor cost is very uneven. The coastal areas labor cost is very, very high, $15,000. The inland, as you move away from coast to the inland, labor cost becomes lower. So some of the factories located on the coastal areas can potentially move inland to take advantage of a lower labor cost in the inland. That's an option for some firms, but not for all the firms, because the logistics cost, transportation cost from inland to the ports is non-trivial. So once you add up the inland low labor cost and the transportation cost, it may not be necessarily that competitive. That's why export-oriented firms in Brazil tend to be located along coast as well. Moving something from the inland to the coast that tend to reduce your competitiveness. But it's an option for some firms moving in. The out part refers to the fact that some Chinese firms could relocate their production to countries with even lower labor costs, combining their know-how, their capital, technology with cheaper labor in Cambodia, Bangladesh, and so on. Indeed, when I visited India, Cambodia, you see a lot of Chinese firms are starting to do that already. Africa, maybe some lower cost Latin American countries as well. They're starting to do that. There's a learning process going on there. Not all firms can succeed right away. Maybe not all firms can succeed, period. But the process that we see that has happened before to Japan, to Korea, to Singapore, and so on. So now we're seeing that happening to Chinese firms as well.
Professor Wei, as I understand, your focus is on the up way out of the situation. What are the solution, innovation to combat inefficiency? What are the way out of the situation and the up?
That's right. But in the long run, up is the right way to go. Up meaning you have to elevate your level of sophistication. You have to have more indigenous innovation. You have to have your own things to do. All countries eventually have to be more innovation based. So that's true for Japan, which used to be a labor intensive producer, to technology intensive producer, which has happened to Korea. Same thing. Until 1980, Korea produced a lot of low cost products. Now you have to produce Samsung, color TV with curved screens and so on, a higher technology intensive products. So China needs to do that too. Can China do that? Well, Brazil, by the way, is of course in the same situation. We know some of the sectors in Brazil are very competitive. I learned that in agriculture business, for example, Brazil has a lot of innovations. In oil drilling itself, Brazil has a lot of innovation. But it's not a broad feature of the economy yet. Many of the manufacturing firms in general are not as competitive in the world market. China, same thing, because the technology-based growth is a new thing for China. Until not long ago, many of my U.S. colleagues and European colleagues are telling us that Chinese companies only know how to do copycats. They copy other firms' idea. You can no longer survive based on that. So Chinese firms have to innovate. So one of the big questions is, are Chinese firms becoming more innovative? So I take a careful look at the data, and I find you can find some encouraging signs that innovation is taking place. The pace of innovation is picking up. For example, if you look at the patent applications, it's one of the many ways to measure innovation. Chinese firm patent application at home has increased a lot, so much so that today there are more patent applications from Chinese firms than from U.S. firm or firm from any other country. So China becomes the #1 country in terms of patent application at home. So that's one interesting observation. But patent application at home is not good enough, because it's hard to compare quality of a patent across country. One can also look at patent applications by firms from China, from Brazil, from other countries in the United States. So you look at U.S. patents granted to firms from various other countries. So on that score, you also see very rapid increase in patents granted to Chinese firms. Let's think about the China-Brazil comparison, for example. 10 years ago, Brazilian firms ahead of China. Today, Chinese firms in the U.S. receive a lot more patents than firms from Brazil. The Chinese economy is about 5 times as large as Brazil, but the U.S. patent Chinese firm receives much more than 5 times. You say Shang-Jin says about 10 times. I think it's probably not that high, but it's probably 7 or 8 times. So that means firms realize that they need to be more innovation-based. They invest in R&D, and they try very hard, and you see some results of that. So that lead me to conclude that one doesn't need to be very pessimistic about the prospects for the firms to become more innovative. when there's a need.
And in efficiency. One way could be the infrastructure of China. Higher wage costs can be, you can cut the costs, having a infrastructure that makes enterprises, including inside inland China, more cheap to reach the international markets. And Brazil has a great problem in infrastructure.
You mean physical infrastructure or you mean policies?
Physical infrastructure. Brazil is roads and railroads and things like that. And there's one problem in Brazil. That's the crisis, political crisis, and investigations on corruption, including the infrastructure projects in Brazil. Can China invest in Brazilian infrastructure projects, as you have this know-how, because of the massive investment that you had in the past years?
Sure. I mean, Brazil is already a member of multiple development banks, including two of the new ones, the new development banks headquartered in Shanghai, and AIIB headquartered in Beijing, and certainly the new players, together with existing multitude of multinational development banks, can invest in Brazil. Chinese companies can invest in Brazil as well. Now, there's a recognition for many countries, Brazil, China included, that more infrastructure could be helpful to growth. But the gap between infrastructure needed and infrastructure actually built has two pieces. One is financing. Now, China has relatively high savings rate. Brazil has relatively low savings rate. In that context, some infrastructure investment from Chinese firm in Brazil could be helpful. But there's another piece that's also important to bear in mind. That is, sometimes when you see a country not having sufficient infrastructure, it's not just because of lack of money or lack of knowledge. Brazilian population is very well educated. There's no shortage of good engineers. A lot of smart people here, a lot of hardworking people here, and there's no lack of money in the absolute sense either. Very large economy and lots of money around. Some of the times, infrastructure is not built because of risk investors worry about. Infrastructure tend to have a long gestation period. To build a road, you need to spend money in the next 3 years. Typical road takes 3 years to build, let's say. But to recover the cost and to make money, you need, for the next 20 years or more, you will be able to have a revenue stream. They will come to you. In many countries, sometimes politicians, once the road is built, may change their mind about, do I want to allow the toll fee to go up or toll fee to stay high in real term or not? So these kind of political uncertainty could make a project less profitable on an ex-ante basis. So investors do not want to do, right? So security of a contract, security of a future revenue stream, together with the very long duration, that feature of infrastructure make infrastructure projects very, very risky and very, very difficult to manage. So that kind of thing will not be solved by just having foreign capital coming to the country. You need policy reforms. You need other changes to reduce the risk situation.
Professor Wei, it became common to blame China for the decreased prices of commodities. Is it fair to blame China, the slower growth of China, as the main reason for the decrease of the commodity prices?
There are many different kinds of commodities. Many commodities, in my view, whose price rise and fall have relatively little with China. Some could be. So an example of a commodity whose price fluctuation has, relatively small China component is petroleum oil. So, China imports oil, but its import is a relatively small share of global market. So current decline, relatively low commodity prices, oil prices since 2014 had more to do with generally weak global economy than just the Chinese growth moderation itself. There are some other commodities you can see some tighter connection. China is the world's largest copper importer, and Chinese imports somewhere between
iron ore too.
1/3, and iron ore perhaps you may see a tighter connection there. But even for those commodities, I would say the future recovery of those commodity prices does not depend on Chinese growth rate to going back to 10%. For example, India, Vietnam, and other countries are also trying very hard to be a major exporter in the world market. They want to be the next China. If and when those things happen, this will also help to, whatever China used to be producing, watches, toys, washing machines, car parts, and so on, need to be produced by someone, because the world as a whole is not consuming less of those. If they are not produced by China, they have to be produced by Brazil, by India, by some other countries. So those countries' production will also push up global demand for those commodities. So this commodity price can very well recover without Chinese growth rate to go back to 10%. Indeed, the new US president, Donald Trump, now he talks about massive infrastructure investment in the US per se has pushed up expectation about the future commodity prices. Now we see increasing oil price, increasing steel price, and so on, partly because of the anticipation that US might get into a major infrastructure construction wave, and which will raise the demand for some of those commodities. So that would be good news for Brazil.
Talking about Donald Trump and not so many good news, he was during the campaign very assertive regarding China. He talked about, I think that 45% tariffs against Chinese products. How can his government affect China in the world scene?
Based on what he has said and based on what he has written on his website, we see
his Twitter account.
And Twitter accounts, he has very terse description about the policies on China. But his website has a lot of more detailed policy description. There's a mixed bag. For example, his infrastructure program, in principle, will be very helpful to Brazil and to China, because China is, I previously said China is the world's largest garment exporter. China is also the world's largest steel exporter. And steel prices are relatively low in the world, and many steel companies in China are not doing well. Trump can single-handedly helping a lot of Chinese steel makers and companies that produce equipment that go into the steel makers. Now, TPP is a regional trading bloc that includes 12 countries, but not including China. Free trade agreement, as we know, is not free trade, because free trade agreement is not just about free trade, because when you form a free trade agreement among certain number of countries, 12 countries, including some country, excluding other countries, you actually create discriminations. That's the nature of a free trade agreement. You allow for free trade among member countries, but you maintain tariff on imports from non-member countries, which artificially makes non-member countries' products look less competitive, even if they are truly more competitive on a global setting. China being most efficient producer in many, many sectors could be hurt by TPP. So in that sense, withdrawing from TPP could be helpful to Chinese economy. Certainly many firms are considering this. The 45% tariff, if he wants to do it, certainly could hurt Chinese firms. It will also hurt American firms and American consumers. Many Chinese firms, many Chinese exports to the US, low-cost consumer products. They're really helping poor households in the US. You go to Walmart and so on. You see a lot of Chinese-made products. A typical customer in Walmart tends to come from low-income family or lower middle-income family in the US. They benefit from imports from China by seeing a higher real income for given amount of dollar they receive at home lower price means they can buy more stuff. 45% tariff increase means they have to pay 45% more on the stuff they buy. So they will be hurting American households. It will also be hurting American firms because a big chunk of Chinese exports to the US are intermediate goods. For example, for US auto companies in Detroit, the number one foreign supply of car parts and components is China. So US auto companies' global competitiveness depends in part on its ability to buy least cost products from China. So raising tariff on imports on China means raising cost of production for automobile companies in the US and other companies in the US. In fact, it will hurt US global competitiveness. On top of that, China being a very large trading nation, larger than US in terms of exports, would not take this as given. China can sue the US at WTO, simultaneously retaliate by raising imports on US, raising tariff on US imports as well. So the 45% tariff is unlikely to do US any good if Mr. Trump is smart enough, or if he has smart enough advisors, he will soon recognize this. So it's probably more of a threat than something that he will put into place.
Changing topic, Professor, what do you think about the Brics project? You already mentioned the new Bank of Development. What do you think about the Brics?
Brics initially, 20-some years ago, was just a marketing label suggested by investment bank to label the 4 largest emerging market economies. At the time, there was not really much coherence among the 4, but since then, over time, I understand there has been a lot more coordination among BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Often, South Africa is the S part of the BRICS. During the international trade negotiation, climate change agreement, and many other settings. That coordination could be helpful in, it promotes more consultation among major developing countries. It promotes potential coordinations and so on. So that's that could be useful. I mean, in the end, this is not really a formal entity. I guess now they we see a BRICS bank or new development bank out there. That becomes a more concrete physical entity. Given that the world needs more infrastructure, that could be helpful. My personal guess is that AIIB, the one that's headquartered in Beijing, will have relatively easier time to operate and to be successful than BRICS Bank. And that's because BRICS Bank, by having fewer members, are less diversified in its products, so take on a lot more risk. Many of the member economies of the BRICS Bank have economic difficulties at home. So investing in those countries will give you more risk for those projects. For development bank to work, the very important thing is that you have to diversify your risk. For AIIB, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, by being able to invest in many, many more countries, your overall portfolio has lower risk. So that's a challenge that the BRICS Bank has to face.
Professor Shang-Jin Wei, thank you very much for your time with us. Thank you.